Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociology of India, in today's lecture we're going to discuss about development planning in India. Development planning with reference to the nature of social change that has taken place in India. It's very important to understand planning and in relation to development, because planning becomes very essential when there is a target of a country like India facing a huge crisis of poverty, illiteracy, and unemployment. So we need to do a historical transition of development planning since the genesis and even during the colonial period, and then taking a concrete shape with the independence and setting up of the Planning Commission in India. So let us first understand, what do we mean by planning? So if we try to understand planning, it is a blueprint. It's a blueprint of how social change to take place in society, in the sense that we need to have a kind of a futuristic vision of our society, that from a long period of time, in certain directions, policies and programs are framed. What would be the outcome in order to meet the target of, say, an egalitarian society, a just society, along with economic growth and development? Therefore, planning takes place in a larger context as policy formulations. So we kind of understand the ground problems that is being faced by a country or a nation, and then try to frame a policy which would give us a solution in the long run. So policy formulation and realization through choice and rationalization. So planning is essential. It's very important for a society in order to ensure there is growth and development. It is essential because it enables us to formulate with some precision what we need to achieve within a given time frame. So it's more scientific towards achieving development objective and for bringing about economic and social transformation in a systematic manner. So it kind of gives you a target. It sets a target which has to be met within a time bound period, and then the outcome would show whether the nation has progressed in terms of socio-economic development. And why we need to talk about development planning, or why we need to understand development planning in order to understand society in India, is to look into the condition of the society at the time of independence. And we know that the India time it got independence, the major two problems faced by the was, number one, that it was trying to consolidate number of areas and region into one nation state, and second, to kind of overcome the feudal social structure based on inequalities of caste, and to kind of move towards an egalitarian social Another problems associated with the constructions of a nation state, a progressive nation state, was to overcome the large-scale poverty, illiteracy, and at the same time the poor agrarian economy. So a large population was in the rural areas. 3/4 of the Indian population was engaged in agricultural work with primitive tools and techniques, and therefore the social economic condition was poor. So the task that was kind of in front of the leaders and policy makers was to kind of construct a society that would be based on the ideas of equitable distribution of resources, in order to ensure that there is an upliftment in the standard of the people, and not only a particular section or particular caste or particular kind of a social fragment, but an egalitarian social order for one and all, because the constitution guaranteed that it was a socialist nation. So the development planning was initiated in India to cater to the developmental needs of the country. Now, if we look back to the history of planning in India, we see that planning in India dates back to 1930s. That is, even before independence, the colonial government had established a planning board that lasted from 1944 to 46. Private industrialists and economists published development plans Indian leaders adopted the principle of formal economic planning soon after independence as an effective way to intervene in the economy to foster growth and social justice. So the idea started generating prior to independence, and since there was a large support of people who thought that the only way to construct a progressive nation was through development plannings. So during the colonial rule, the nationalist leader like Dadabhai Naoroji, M.C. Ranade and R.G. Dutt, they drew attention to the need of planning. So this kind of setting off of the genesis or kind of breeding the idea that India as a nation could only kind of be more progressive through proper framed policies of development. So they were writing, these leaders, nationalist leaders were writing in their books and journals and newspaper articles the need for social economic planning in order to kind of do away with some of the problems that was being faced. These writings raised the concern from the problems of mass poverty, illiteracy, the need for industrialization, and the reconstruction of the entire fabric of social and economic life. Almost all the national leaders looked upon development planning as a means to solve these fundamental problems. So the only solution to the problems of the emerging nation was through development planning. So when we have understood what is planning, why we need development planning, and the conditions that promoted the step towards planning, so we need to kind of also understand this in a more systematic manner. So the first time the idea of planning came into the minds of the leader was in 1934, when the renowned engineer Visvesvaraya formulated a 10-year plan for development in his book Planned Economy for India. So this planned economy was more in terms of the socialist idea of state intervention, where the state had to intervene in terms of regulating competition and capital growth. The second step was in 1938. The National Planning Committee was set up by the Congress President and Subhash Chandra Bose, and this planning committee was later on headed by Jawaharlal Nehru, and he formulated the idea of setting up a National Planning Commission consisting of 15 members and taking concrete steps in drafting policies of development planning. In the history of evolution of planning in India, one point which comes out very significant is the idea of the Bombay Plan. Now, the Bombay Plan was a plan by a number of economists who were kind of in favor of the control or regulation of state policy. So 1944, number of eminent industrialists and economists of Bombay like Purushottam Das, Thakur Das, J.R.D. Tata and 6 others, they made an attempt to publish a development plan that would kind of foster the economic growth in the country, and this plan is referred as the Bombay Plan. It's a predecessor to the more nationalized 5 years plan, which becomes a part of development planning in India. The development plan laid down the roadmap of India's development after independence. And these economists and industrialists, they were kind of looking into the collective growth of the country, and therefore they argued for a very strong role of the state in terms of ensuring the welfare of the citizen, at the same time controlling the monopoly of the private or the industrialist. So the Bombay Plan in many ways was provided the blueprint to Nehru's command economy model. Another similar plan which comes up before independence is M.N. Rao. He prepared a 10-year plan, and this is known as People's Plan. It was different from the Bombay Plan in methodology and priorities. Now, the People's Plan of 1945 emphasized on agricultural and consumer good industries through collectivization and setting up of state-owned industrialization. It also advocated nationalization of land. This plan, the people plan, was very ambitious, and if we kind of, it was within the larger change industrialization taking place in the Western countries. So it was very ambitious, and therefore it was unable to properly mobilize the resources, and it was kind of not very practical in its implications, especially in a country which was almost coming out of a long colonial rule. So, after the whole understanding of the Bombay Plan, the People Plan, would also keep in mind is the historical context for the evolution of development planning in India, and therefore we look into the post-war construction from 1941 to 46. Now, the government of India was considering the plans of post-war reconstruction. In June 1944, Planning and Development Department was created under a separate member of the Executive Council for organizing the planning work in the country. 1946, the work of planning had practically been completed and the department was abolished. When after the post-war period, another plan, which is the third plan, becomes significant to understand the historical evolution is the Gandhian plan. Now, the Gandhian plan was drafted by Sriman Narayan. He was the principal of Wardha Commercial College. This plan, they was kind of talking about decentralization, keeping in mind the ideas or the ideology of Gandhi, who was kind of in favor of decentralization or taking the policies and programs to the mass. So, and also in terms of not only focusing on the urban and the industrial growth, but at the same time catering towards the rural development of the country by developing the cottage industry. Now, the cottage industry had been kind of impacted severely due to the colonial rule and because of the shift towards technology and industrialization. So, this was kind of looking into your own indigenous economy in order to foster economic growth. Now, this Gandhian plan is also kind of goes along with another plan which is quite similar in content is the Sarvodaya plan, which was drafted by Jayaprakash Narayan, and it was inspired by the Gandhian plan. Now, the Sarvodaya was actually inspired by Vinoba Bhave's ideology, which is kind of similarly kind of taking about attention towards the economy in the rural area, in the self-sufficient unit, the handloom industries, and the requirement or the need for land reform and decentralized participatory planning. Now, when we move to post-independent period and look into the step towards development planning, the first thing that comes to mind is to understand the Planning Commission, because the Planning Commission was set up specifically with the task of designing and formulating, implementing the plans in India. So, it was set up in 1950 as the key organization for formulation of plans for development. The Prime Minister was the chairperson of the commission, and the Minister of the State was independent charge for planning and program implementation. A staff draft national plans under the guidance of commission. The drafts plans are presented for approval to the National Development Council, which consists of the Planning Commission and Chief Ministers of the state. So, this is the modus operandi, the way in which it functions and prepares plans. So, if we look into the shift from post-independent 50s and 60s with the setting of the National Planning Commission to 70s and 80s, it's a period when a number of national plans were designed, and the focus of the national plans was mainly to reduce poverty and improve the standard of living of the people. Now, the social indicators in terms of employment rate, the level of poverty index were used in order to understand the economic indicators of growth and development. National plans also began to include chapters dealing with sectoral fields such as education, health and rural development, housing and social work services. So, it was an expansion of the planning process. By 1980s, considerable progress had been made in linking social and economic planning and promoting an unified approach to development. Now, this is kind of tracing it from 1930s to the 80s, and then we will see a certain shifts taking place in the 90s and 20s. But before we look into the shift, we need to understand the architect behind the planning in the post-independent period. So it is obviously Jawaharlal Nehru. He is regarded as the architect of planning. Development model that India chose after independence was greatly driven by Nehruvian ideology. What was his ideology? His ideology was in terms of inspired by the Soviet Union's rapid industrialization and the setting up of 5 years plan in there, and he kind of wanted to replicate the model to India. Nehru viewed planning as a way of developing the country, avoiding unnecessary rigors of industrial transition, insofar as it affected the life of masses living in India's village. So Nehru was very conscious about the fact that everywhere around the industrialization, globalization was happening at a very rapid pace. But in the context of India, one had to balance the agrarian as well as industrial growth. So he recognized planning as a positive instrument of resolving imbalances and contradiction in large and heterogeneous country like India. Nehru believed that massive growth rate is necessary for India to address the problems of hunger, unemployment and poverty. Following the ideas of Mahalanobis, he indicated a big plan approach for different sectors as essential for economic growth. So you cannot have one that fits all. In other, every sector has its own problems and its own criteria or target of growth. Therefore, the plan had to be sectoral and attention had to be given to these sectors separately. So it was perceived that India's land reform system, the rural cooperatives, green revolution, public distribution can bring about revolution in the agrarian sector. So this was one sector which was being kind of not doing extremely well, and there was a kind of a lot of laws and agrarian conditions was kind of deteriorating. Therefore, there was need to kind of prepare plans and programs that would focus in terms of revitalizing the agrarian sector. Similarly, the government control over industry was considered essential for economic growth. Now, when we look into Nehru and the Planning Commission, what needs to be kept in mind is look into the way in which the 5-year plans have been developed. Now, we would not be going into the details of each of the 5-year plan because there have been 12 5-year plans since 1951, but we can just kind of have a very brief idea in terms of how development planning has taken place in the country through these 5-year plan. So 5-year plan, the first 5-year plan was launched in 1951, and since then it has witnessed 12 5-year plan with different objective and results, and there's a lot of overchange in terms of the budget allocations, in terms of variance in the sectors from a large to the social sector to a decline in the health and education, growth in the budget in the defense. So these are some of the kind of objective analysis of the 5-year plan. But what the objective of lecture is not to do into a critical analysis of it, but to understand the nature of development planning in India. So these 5-year plans were introduced and implemented to deal with economic challenges faced by India as in respective time frame. And these economic challenges were kind of considered, some challenges were considered more significant than the other, and therefore the focus in that particular plan of the particular period was different. So there's a lot of kind of shifts and continuities in terms of looking into these plans. By 2015, the 5-year plans kind was replaced by a 15-year vision plan supported by 3-year action plan. Also, when we look into their development planning, what we also need to keep in mind is the role of the national government and the political ideology which are there and the differences or the way in which change takes place is also because of the shift and change in the political parties and the national government. So, from 2015 onward, we see that the government kind of is not in support of a short-term plan of a 5-year, but is kind of visioning a more larger period, because in order to kind of see a concrete outcome, 5 years was considered to be a smaller time span. So, a longer long-term vision for growth and development in various sectors and fields were kind of envisioned by the leaders. So, the first 5-year plan, it focused on expanding the public sector through massive investment in heavy and basic sectors. So, we see this for the first 8-year plan was kind of from the 1950s to say the late 90s. So, this is kind of also a time when India was in this process of industrialization, and focus of Nehru was to kind of look into industries and dams as kind of religious achievements, and therefore these plans focused on large scale industrialization. The 1997, the 9th 5-year plan, the focus, there is a shift in the focus, where now the government is kind of not considered as an investor, but as a growth facilitator. So, each of these 5-year plan, they had a kind of a period which is begins from the beginning of April 1st and ends on the March 31st. But we see the all of these are not actually 5 years. Some of them kind of ended at 4 years. There was a disruption because of political instability, because of war and other say famine or other kind of socio-economic conditions in the country. So, between the 3rd and the 4th 5-year, 3 annual plans were introduced. So, this is also because of the change in the government, and because of the change in the government, there is a difference in opinion which the government does not want to kind of continue with it, and therefore in 1977 with the Janata Alliance government, they abandoned the 5th plan a year ahead. And by 1978, the Janata government implemented rolling plan in place of a regular plan. So, 78 to 1983, there was this rolling plan, which is actually the 6th plan, but the kind of terminology kind of differs. But once again, the government changes and the 7th 5-year plan comes back to the place. So, India's economy was in disarray in the 1992, because we know that this is also a 1991 is a landmark in the economic transition of India, which is kind of considered as a time when structural adjustment programs were introduced. So, the 8th 5-year plan began a little later because of the financial crisis. Now, the 8th year plan comes in at a time where the structural adjustment program has taken place and the country has shifted towards the LPG, which is liberalization, privatization and globalization. So, we will understand this shift towards the LPG more in detail when we look into the shift from a mixed economy to a neoliberal economy. Now, after the 8th 5-year plan, we have the 9th 5-year plan, which was from 1997 to 2002, and the main goal here was growth with social justice and equality. The 10th 5-year plan was the period was 2002 to 2007. The goal of this period was to double India's per capita income in the next year. So, we see this shift towards neoliberalization, where the concern from a welfare state to a state which is kind of supporting privatization and liberalization on a large scale. So, the 11th 5-year plan was focus was on rapid and more inclusive growth, and if we look into it, there is a kind of a shift from social sector to large kind of investment and growth in the private sector as well as the idea of kind of in just increasing the GDP of the country, and that could kind of lead into also a critique of the 5-year plan, where it kind of looks into creating a wide inequality between those who are able to kind of benefit from these plans and programs and those who don't. So the 12th plan, which was the last in the out of the 5-year plan, was the faster, more inclusive and sustainable growth. Now the sustainability becomes more significant on the international agenda, and that India kinds of takes on, and there is a lot of talk and lot of focus also because of the idea of the environment and sustainability being at risk because of the large scale industrialization and urbanization that take place in over a period of 2 to 3 decades. Now, if we look into the post 5-year planning, that is till 12th 5-year plans, what happened post this was the NDA government, they kind of was of opinion that one size fits all approach could only go so far in a country as diverse and large as India. So the whole idea was kind of not in favor of the 5-year plan, and the Planning Commission was abandoned and abolished and replaced by the Niti Aayog. Now, it is Niti Aayog which kind of documents the plans, development plans in the country, but this is different between the Planning Commission and the Niti Aayog, because they are only there to kind of provide the guidance or policy guide maps to the country. And the 3-year action plan simply serves as a general roadmap for the government. It does not define any plans of allocation as it was done in the 5-year plan. So the whole idea of understanding the development planning and tracing the discourse of development from, say, the 1930s to the current period, we get a good idea that the development planning in India has been standardized and focused towards a kind of growth and development, but then there are a lot of critique to the way in which development has taken place, and one of the largest critique which comes in from planning is the lack of implementations of these plans, and as a result some of the problems which kind of was there in the initial continues to dominate the country. So we could have a good idea of development planning in India. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.